This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Makt Myrkranna, or Powers of Darkness, is a 1901 Icelandic version of Bram Stoker's Dracula that was long mistaken for a simple translation. Translated and radically rewritten by Valdemar Asmundsson, an expert in the medieval sagas, this Gothic work remained a hidden literary masquerade for over a century. This work demands re-examination following the 2014 discovery that it is a structurally distinct text that fundamentally alters the mechanics of the vampire myth. In this episode, we examine the work from several angles: its dramatic narrative restructuring into a claustrophobic slow burn, the recasting of the Count as a Nietzschean political revolutionary, and the infusion of Nordic weirdness that reanimates the vampire through the lens of the Icelandic Draugr. Even if you know the world's most famous vampire, we invite you to set aside your assumptions and encounter a version far darker and more visceral than the Victorian original. Chapter 1. The Century of the Shadow. The history of Gothic literature is often a history of shadows, but rarely has a shadow been as long or as deceptive as the one cast by the Icelandic version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. For over a century, the work titled Makt Myrkranna, or Powers of Darkness, existed in a state of quiet, unchallenged masquerade. Published in Reykjavik in 1901, it was accepted by the Icelandic public and international bibliographers alike as a simple, albeit abridged, translation of Stoker's 1897 masterpiece. This assumption of fidelity was so pervasive that even when the scholarly world finally turned its gaze toward Iceland in the late 20th century, it saw only what it expected to see: a peripheral translation of a central Victorian text. It was not until 2014 that this literary facade collapsed, revealing that Makt Myrkranna was not a translation at all, but a radical, unauthorized, and structurally distinct rewrite that fundamentally alters the mechanics of the vampire myth. To understand the depth of this masquerade, we must first look at the reception history and the critical blind spots that allowed it to persist. The book's journey began not as a bound volume, but as a serialization in the newspaper Fjallkonan, running from January 13, 1900 to March 20, 1901. When it finally appeared in book form in 1901, it carried with it a series of bibliographic oddities that should have piqued the interest of collectors and scholars much sooner. The publisher was listed as Nokkrir Prentarar, which translates to various publishers, a shadowy designation that leaves the actual identity of the book's financer a mystery to this day. Furthermore, the 1901 edition contains a specific quirk that went unnoticed by librarians for decades. Page numbers 161 through 166 are used twice. This means the book is actually 216 pages long rather than the 210 pages indicated by the final numbering. In a chapter of literary history defined by a masquerade, this bibliographic error serves as a perfect metaphor for the work itself, a book that was literally hiding more content than it appeared to have. For decades, the text was dismissed as an abridged translation because it was shorter than the English original, a common trait for foreign editions in small markets like Iceland. This reveals a profound bias in the history of literary reception, where works from the periphery are assumed to be passive recipients of central culture. The masquerade was maintained not by a lack of evidence, but by a lack of curiosity. For 100 years, scholars simply looked at the cover and the preface and never turned the pages to see the divergence within. When the Dutch scholar Hans Corneel de Roos finally scrutinized the text in 2014, the discovery was made possible through a fascinating modern anecdote of crowdsourced scholarship. Because de Roos did not speak Icelandic, he enlisted a team of 25 Icelandic native speakers to translate the text into English. This collective effort revealed that the divergence from Stoker's original was not subtle, it was total. A structuralist analysis of the two works reveals a complete re-engineering of the narrative architecture. Stoker's Dracula is a triumph of the epistolary form, a polyphonic collection of diaries, letters, and newspaper clippings that build a sense of modern bureaucratic dread. Makt Myrkranna, however, abandons this complexity for a much more traditional and, in some ways, more visceral narrative split. The book is divided into two distinct parts, creating what is now known as the 80-20th structural split. The first part, comprising the vast majority of the text, roughly 80%, focuses entirely on the protagonist's stay at Castle Dracula. In Stoker's version, Jonathan Harker's Transylvanian Journal is merely the first movement of a larger symphony, occupying only the first few chapters before the narrative shifts to England. In Makt Myrkranna, the castle stay is the symphony itself. The second part of the Icelandic text, which covers the entire London plot, the death of Lucy, the pursuit of the Count, and the final confrontation, is condensed into a mere 40 pages of omniscient narration. This structural choice creates a slow burn effect that radically changes the reader's relationship with the protagonist, who is here renamed Thomas Harker. A formalist reading of these early chapters shows a narrator who is much more oblivious and vulnerable than Stoker's Jonathan. In the 1897 novel, Jonathan realizes he is a prisoner almost immediately, noting the locked doors and the Count's lack of servants with a lawyer's precision. Thomas Harker, conversely, lingers in a state of suspended disbelief, wandering through a castle that is far more Gothic and grotesque than Stoker's. The architecture itself becomes a character. The choice to expand the castle segment while gutting the London pursuit suggests a different set of priorities, moving away from Stoker's interest in modern technology and Victorian teamwork and toward a more primal, claustrophobic horror. This slow burn interpretation, as noted by critics like Michael Melgard, is effectively tied to the narrative architecture. By lingering in the castle, the text forces the reader to inhabit the protagonist's growing dread in a way that the fast-paced English original does not. However, the timeline of exposure took another turn in 2017, when it was discovered that the Icelandic text was not even translated directly from the English original, but from a Swedish serialization titled Mörkrets Makter, published in 1899. This discovery complicates the narrative of the work's origin, suggesting a decentralized Nordic remix culture where editors and translators felt free to improve foreign texts for local audiences. The transformation of Jonathan to Thomas, Mina to Wilma, and Lucy to Lucia might not be a sign of a lost manuscript, but a conscious effort to localize the story, or perhaps to evade the strict copyright protections of the era. The masquerade of Makt Myrkranna is further complicated by its stylistic shift in Part 2. The move from Thomas Harker's diary to an omniscient narrator is a jarring departure from Stoker's epistolary discipline. In a structuralist sense, the epistolary form is a democratic one. It relies on the shared evidence of multiple witnesses to prove the existence of the supernatural. By collapsing the second half of the novel into a brief third-person summary, Makt Myrkranna centralizes authority. It moves away from the collective effort of the Crew of Light and places the focus back on the singular, terrifying presence of the Count. This shift also allows the narrative to bypass the more meandering sections of the original, creating a punchier, more streamlined progression. The exposure of this rewrite in 2014 did more than just correct a bibliographic error. It challenged our understanding of Dracula as a stable, fixed text. It forces us to ask, what is the real Dracula? Is it the refined, Victorian sanitized version published by Constable in 1897? Or is it the raw, eroticized, and politically charged version that fermented in the Nordic newspapers? This version suggests a desire to ground the Count in a more human, and therefore more terrifyingly political reality. As we move from the history of the book's discovery into the contents of the narrative itself, we find that the most radical change is not in the names of the characters or the layout of the castle, but in the nature of the villain. Stoker's Dracula is a solitary predator, a remnant of a feudal past trying to survive in a modern world. The Dracula of Makt Myrkranna is something else entirely. He is a man of his time, or perhaps a man of a dark future, who has traded the solitude of the grave for the corridors of power. This shift raises a haunting question. If the masquerade of the book itself could stay hidden for a century, what else was the Count hiding in those expanded Transylvanian chapters? Chapter 2: The Architect of the Dark Revolution. In the standard 1897 text of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the titular Count is a figure of profound isolation. He is the king vampire, certainly, but his power is expressed through a lonely, atavistic hunger. He is a remnant of a feudal past, a solitary predator who moves through the shadows of a modernizing London like a ghost in the machine of Victorian progress. However, when we turn to the pages of Makt Myrkranna, we encounter a character who has undergone a startling metamorphosis. This Count is no longer merely a supernatural parasite. He is a visionary of a dark new world order. Through the research of scholars like Richard Berghorn, who uncovered the political and espionage elements of the source material, we can see that this version recasts Dracula as the architect of a global social Darwinist revolution. He is a Nietzschean Superman who has traded the solitude of the tomb for the clandestine meetings of a political cabal. To understand this transformation, we must first examine the specific rhetorical choices made in the Count's dialogues with Thomas Harker. In Stoker's original, the Count's speeches are often nostalgic, dwelling on the military glories of the Seychelles and the ancient defense of the frontier. In the Icelandic version, the Count's focus shifts from the historical to the philosophical and the perspective. He is frequently referred to as Draculitz, a name that underscores his persona as a modern baron and socialite rather than a feudal relic. He speaks with a distinct contempt for the Christian ethos, specifically targeting its veneration of the weak and its emphasis on humility and sacrifice. He declares a manifest destiny for the strong ones, asserting that the world must eventually bow before those who have the will to exert their power without the hindrance of traditional morality. This is a direct application of the Nietzschean will to power, framing Dracula's vampirism as a literalization of his belief that the strong should consume the weak. His contempt for the weak is a direct transvaluation of values, a specific Nietzschean concept where the traditional moral order is inverted to favor the predatory elite. In this worldview, the vampire's feeding is not a curse or a biological necessity, but a philosophical right. The Count views himself as the vanguard of a new stage of human evolution, one that has moved beyond the slave morality of the masses. This intellectualization of the vampire's nature transforms the horror from a physical threat to an ideological one, suggesting that the Count's most dangerous weapon is not his fangs, but his ability to justify his atrocities through the language of modern philosophy. The most concrete evidence of this political evolution is the introduction of a secret society of European elites that Dracula leads from his base in London. In Stoker's version, Dracula's move to England is a solitary migration, a predator seeking a more populous hunting ground. In the Icelandic text, he is the head of a sophisticated international conspiracy. The narrative provides specific names that make this cabal feel dangerously concrete: Professor Hezerick, the hypnotist Arnholm, and the mysterious agent Patterson. These are not mere monsters, but high-ranking diplomats and intellectuals orchestrating a great revolution aimed at subjugating the masses. This version of the Count operates not through the shadows of the East End, but through the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. The horror here is not that a monster is hiding among us, but that the ruling class itself has become monstrous, adopting a philosophy that views the common people as nothing more than cattle to be managed and harvested. A crucial smoking gun for this political reading is the inclusion of references to the Orleans conspiracy of 1898 to 99. By anchoring the Count's ambitions in real-world French monarchist intrigue, the text transforms him into a modern political creature. This persona aligns with Stoker's discarded notes regarding Inspector Barrington, suggesting that the author's early vision for the novel was more grounded in the gritty political reality of London's secret societies. The Count's dialogue further links his social Darwinism to real-world urban violence. He speaks with chilling detachment regarding the victims of the city's underbelly, viewing the violence of the metropole as a natural extension of his own predatory logic. He views the chaos of the modern city not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be exploited, a testing ground for the survival of the fittest in an industrial age. A formalist reading of the Count's physical presence in Makt Myrkranna further underscores this shift towards social power. He is remarkably human and strikingly public, moving through the world with a confidence that belies his supernatural nature. He is the last guest to arrive at dinner parties, a trait Stoker noted in his early drafts but omitted from the 1897 novel. This suggests that his monstrosity is hidden just beneath the socialite veneer, a predatory nature that he masks with the language of high society and the manners of the elite. His followers, including the ape-like minions who serve him, are not merely supernatural entities, but the political foot soldiers of his new order, representing the degenerate masses serving a ruthless elite. These figures serve as a physical manifestation of the Count's belief in a natural hierarchy, where the many are sacrificed to sustain the power of the few. The role of Dr. Seward in Makt Myrkranna provides further evidence for this psychological and sociological shift. In Stoker's version, Seward is the quintessential man of science, using his phonograph and his clinical observations to battle the irrational. In the Icelandic text, Seward is broken by the Count, descending into madness as a result of the horrors he witnesses. This change removes the buffer of scientific rationality that protects the heroes in the 1897 novel. Without a stable scientific observer, the narrative descends into a more chaotic ideological struggle. The absence of Renfield, the zoophagous maniac who serves as Dracula's mirror in the original, further isolates the Count's actions, making them appear less like a clinical condition and more like a deliberate philosophical choice. Dracula doesn't need a madman to worship him because he has diplomats and aristocrats to do his bidding, suggesting that the madness of the Count's vision has already been normalized by those in power. The mainstream interpretation of this political Dracula often views him as a Bond villain prototype, a more action-oriented antagonist designed to suit the sensationalist tastes of newspaper serialization. Critics argue that the editors were tapping into the burgeoning genre of the spy thriller and the yellow peril literature of the time, where the threat was often an organized foreign conspiracy rather than a solitary ghost. However, a more contrarian reading suggests that this political Dracula is actually a profound critique of late Victorian imperialism and the social Darwinist justifications for it. Through this lens, the Count is not an other coming from the East to contaminate the West. He is the West's own logic taken to its most terrifying conclusion. If the British Empire justified its expansion through the idea of the survival of the fittest, then Dracula is the ultimate imperialist, a figure who has simply removed the mask of civilizing mission to reveal the raw hunger beneath. We must weigh these interpretations against the specific structural choices of the text, particularly the ending. In Stoker's Dracula, the Count is driven out of London and pursued back to his homeland in a grand chase that reestablishes the boundaries between East and West, between the modern and the ancient. In Makt Myrkranna, the climax is a localized surgical strike. Dracula is killed in his London home by Van Helsing and his men. This ending feels less like a religious exorcism and more like a political assassination. By removing the flight back to Transylvania, the narrative keeps the threat rooted in the heart of the metropole. The conspiracy's broader tendrils remain unresolved, suggesting that while the leader is dead, the ideology and the network he built still persist. This lack of a total victory reinforces the sociological reading. You can kill a man, but you cannot so easily kill a secret society or a revolutionary movement that has already taken root in the structures of power. Ultimately, the transformation of Count Dracula in the Icelandic version reflects a world that was becoming increasingly aware of the power of ideology and the fragility of social structures. The solitary predator of the Carpathian Mountains was no longer enough to satisfy the anxieties of a public facing the dawn of a new, more organized century. They needed a villain who could master the systems of the modern world, someone who understood that blood is not just a source of life, but a tool of political control. This shift redefines the Crew of Light as a resistance movement fighting against a systemic takeover. Their struggle is not just for the soul of a single victim, but for the future of Western democracy itself. The Great Revolution that Dracula outlines transforms a Gothic horror story into a proto-political thriller, raising the question of whether the heroes themselves must adopt some of the Count's ruthlessness to defeat an ideology that views their very existence as a weakness to be purged. The Count becomes a mirror for the 20th century's coming horrors, a figure who understands that the most effective way to consume a society is from the inside out, using its own laws and its own elites as the instruments of its destruction. Chapter 3: The Altar of the Flesh. If Bram Stoker's Dracula is a masterpiece of Victorian repression, where the erotic is sublimated into the clinical and the supernatural is filtered through a sieve of modern bureaucracy, Makt Myrkranna is its shadow twin, a work that gleefully tears away the lace curtains of 19th-century propriety. In this Icelandic version, and the Swedish text from which it derives, we encounter a phenomenon that can only be described as Nordic weirdness. This is a narrative mode that leans into the visceral, the carnal, and the ritualistic with a directness that makes Stoker's original seem almost chaste. The horror in Makt Myrkranna is not found in what is whispered or implied, but in what is explicitly shown: the heaving bosom, the denuded victim, and the blood-soaked altar of a black mass. By examining this shift through a psychological and formalist lens, we can see that the Icelandic text does not just add sex and violence. It fundamentally recenters the vampire myth around the body and its transgressions. A formalist analysis of the text's descriptive language reveals a protagonist who is sensory-obsessed in a way Jonathan Harker never was. Thomas Harker uses his diary for a documentation of the flesh, possessed by a roving anatomical gaze. The narrative is punctuated by frequent, almost rhythmic references to the bosoms of the women he encounters, an obsession that borders on the pathological. Whether it is the peasant women at the inn or the spectral inhabitants of the castle, Thomas's attention is consistently drawn to the physical, specifically the eroticized female form. This is not merely a stylistic quirk, it is a structural shift. In Stoker's version, the three sisters represent a moment of singular, terrifying temptation that Jonathan immediately tries to repress. In Makt Myrkranna, this erotic tension is a constant ambient noise. Thomas does not just record the horror, he records his own arousal, creating a narrative that feels less like a travelogue and more like a fevered confession. This heightened sexuality finds its most potent expression in the character of Josephine. While Stoker's brides are a collective predatory force, vague, white-clad figures who represent a fractured threat, Josephine is a singular, vivid, and highly specific presence. She is described with a focus on her indecent appearance, her neck and upper chest revealed in a way that Thomas finds both scandalous and irresistible. The focus on her necklace of glittering diamonds against her bare skin serves as a motif of decadent excess. Through a psychological reading, Josephine functions as the return of the repressed in a much more literal sense than Stoker's vampires. She flaunts her sexuality as a weapon of class and power, representing a feminine agency that is entirely untethered from Victorian morality. The Nordic weirdness here lies in the refusal to sanitize this attraction. Thomas's obsession with her is not a brief lapse in judgment, but a sustained psychological state that the narrative explores with a modern, almost clinical frankness. The mainstream interpretation of this eroticism is often dismissed as simple sensationalism, a strategy designed to sell newspapers to a rural public. The critic Colin Fleming suggests the book could have been aptly subtitled Lust in a Cape. Critics argue that by amping up the sexuality, the editors were merely following the trends of cheap continental fiction, providing their readers with the kind of titillation that the more respectable British publishers would have censored. In this view, the anatomical focus is decorative, a way to spice up a story that could, in its original form, be tedious and meandering. It is the 19th century equivalent of clickbait, using the vampire as a vehicle for softcore pornography. However, a more contrarian reading suggests that this eroticized focus is a deliberate subversion of the Victorian gentleman archetype. By forcing Thomas to constantly confront and record his own sexual fixations, the narrative strips him of his moral armor. Thomas is a much more vulnerable and fractured character precisely because he is aware of his own complicity in the Count's world. His gaze is not just predatory, it is self-destructive. From this perspective, the Nordic weirdness is a psychological experiment. What happens to the rational Western man when his repressed desires are given physical form in a Transylvanian castle? The sexuality is not just there to entertain the reader, it is there to break the protagonist. This focus on the carnal is inextricably linked to the visceral horror that pervades the narrative. Stoker's Castle Dracula is a place of dust and shadows, but the Icelandic castle is a place of rot and ritual. The narrative reveals the monster beneath the socialite veneer through animalistic details that are absent from the English original. Thomas observes the Count behaving in a manner that is strikingly animal-like, specifically mentioning him scratching and licking with long scratching claws like a cat. This visceral detail bridges the gap between the sophisticated baron and the primitive predator. The horror is further grounded in the discovery of a denuded female victim outside the castle, a specific and haunting image that reinforces the visceral nature of the Count's cruelty. This is not the clean death of a vampire bite. It is a slaughter that leaves the body exposed and broken. This culminates in the most radical addition to the narrative, the Black Mass. In a sequence entirely absent from Stoker's original, Thomas watches from a hidden vantage point as the Count performs a satanic ritual in the bowels of the castle. This scene is a masterclass in the visceral. We are shown a horde of followers who witness the sacrifice of almost nude female victims on a primitive altar. The horror reaches a fever pitch when a girl is bitten to death by ogres, the Count's primitive minions, while he presides over the carnage. Through a sociological lens, this scene reflects late 19th century anxieties about the primitive lurking beneath the surface of civilization. The ogres are a literalization of evolutionary regression, the degenerate masses serving a ruthless master. This is not just a vampire feeding, it is a society being unmade. The Black Mass redefines the nature of the Count's evil. In Stoker's version, the horror of the vampire is an inverted communion. The blood is the life, but it is stolen rather than given. Makt Myrkranna takes this religious inversion and makes it literal, theatrical, and bloody. The Count is no longer a solitary figure, he is a ritualistic butcher. This formalist shift from the stealth predator to the cult leader changes the rhythm of the horror. It moves the narrative from the personal to the public. The human sacrifice is an act of political and spiritual theater designed to solidify the Count's power over his followers. The Nordic weirdness here is found in the juxtaposition of the ancient, primitive ritual with the Count's sophisticated rhetoric. He is a modern man, using the most ancient of horrors to achieve his ends, turning the castle into a site of forensic nightmare. The mainstream reading of these ritualistic elements often connects them to the influence of other Gothic authors, such as Edgar Allan Poe. Critics point to the Count's blood-red cloak during these ceremonies as a direct reference to the Mask of the Red Death. In this view, the Icelandic and Swedish authors were simply remixing the greatest hits of Gothic horror to create a more potent brew. The Black Mass is seen as a decorative addition, a way to make the Count more villainous by associating him with the most taboo acts of the Victorian imagination. It is an aesthetic choice, meant to heighten the Gothicness of the castle and provide a more dramatic backdrop for Thomas's imprisonment. This carnal, visceral focus is anchored by the startling reference to Sigmund Freud. In Makt Myrkranna, Wilma is described as having traveled to Vienna to be treated by Freud. This is not merely a clever anachronism, it is a structural tell that reframes the entire narrative. By placing the heroine in the care of the father of psychoanalysis, the text invites us to read the vampire encounter as a clinical case study in trauma and sexual awakening. In Stoker's version, Mina's psychic connection to Dracula is a spiritual and telepathic bond. In Makt Myrkranna, it is grounded in the psychology and natural sciences that the preface mentions. The Freud reference suggests that the powers of darkness are not just external monsters, but internal psychic forces. The Nordic weirdness is thus revealed to be a psychological realism disguised as Gothic excess. The bosoms, the blood, and the black masses are the raw materials of the subconscious, rendered in the vivid, uncompromising language of a dream. The role of the ogres further complicates this psychological landscape. If the Count represents the hyper-rational, ruthless superego of the New Order, these minions represent the id, the primal, unchecked impulses that the Count harnesses for his own ends. Thomas's horror at watching these creatures is the horror of recognizing the animal within the human. This theme of devolution was a central anxiety of the 1890s, fueled by misinterpretations of Darwinian theory. Makt Myrkranna leans into this anxiety with a visceral intensity that Stoker avoids. Stoker's Dracula can turn into a wolf or a bat, but he remains an aristocrat. The Icelandic Dracula doesn't need to change his shape because he already has a literal army of subhumans to do his bidding. This choice makes the Count's power feel more systemic and less like a magic trick. The visceral nature of Makt Myrkranna also serves to ground the story in a more Sherlockian reality. The focus on urban crime and the mention of Nordic noir elements connect the supernatural Count to the very real, very bloody crimes of the London streets. This creates an atmosphere of modern dread before the term even existed. By entering the weird in the visceral, the narrative forces the reader to accept the vampire as a physical reality. He is not a ghost. He is a killer who leaves a mess. As we weigh these readings, the sensationalist clickbait versus the subversive psychological realism, we are left with a text that is far more challenging than a simple translation. Makt Myrkranna uses the visceral and the erotic to bypass the intellectual defenses of the reader. It wants us to feel the reek of decay and the pull of the indecent Josephine. It replaces Stoker's pity and terror with something more primal, lust and revulsion. This Nordic weirdness suggests that the vampire is not just a figure of Victorian anxiety, but a permanent resident of the human psyche, a creature that thrives wherever the body is repressed and the strong are allowed to operate without restraint. The unresolved tension in these scenes, between the beautiful Josephine and the rotting corpses, between the sophisticated Count and his scratching, licking animalism, creates a narrative that feels perpetually off balance. It is a world where the logical whole promised in the preface is constantly being undermined by the incomprehensible nature of the events themselves. As we move toward the mystery of the preface itself and the question of who actually wrote these words, we have to ask, was this visceral and eroticized version a betrayal of Stoker's intent, or was it the only way to truly translate the powers of darkness for a new, more cynical century? For nearly a century, the only part of the Icelandic Dracula that was known to the English-speaking world was its preface. Long before the full extent of the novel's divergence was understood, this brief introductory text existed as a haunting anomaly in the history of Gothic literature. It was a ghost text, existing in isolation from the English-speaking world until its first inclusion in an English edition of Dracula in 2017. This massive publication gap, over 100 years where the preface was known only to a handful of scholars and the Icelandic public, emphasizes how long this literary mystery remained hidden in plain sight. The scholar Richard Dalby had unearthed this text in 1986, and for decades it served as the primary evidence for the first draft theory. Dated August 1898, over a year after the publication of the English Dracula, it is signed by Bram Stoker, yet it contains claims and references that appear nowhere else in his known body of work. It is the architectural cornerstone of the mystery, but it is also the site of a profound literary forgery. A forensic analysis of the preface reveals a narrator who is moving away from the realm of fiction and into the territory of the true crime report. The text employs a classic Gothic frame, the claim of the mysterious manuscript. But it does so with a specificity that is jarring. The narrator asserts that the events of the novel really took place, and that the characters are his personal friends. This claim of veracity, known as euhemerism, was a common trope in 18th-century Gothic novels, but the preface uses it to resolve a glaring inconsistency between the Icelandic text and the English original. The narrator explains that while he is using the real names of Jonathan and Mina Harker in this introduction, the following narrative uses pseudonyms, Thomas and Wilma, to protect the privacy of the survivors. This defensive maneuver establishes a sense of veracity, suggesting that the Icelandic version is the unaltered record of events, while the English version is the one that has been sanitized or changed. The most provocative evidence for Stoker's authorship lies in the preface's specific references to London's criminal history, which align perfectly with his private research. The text mentions the murders committed by Jack the Ripper, referred to as Jakobskvídrastara in the Icelandic, and the slaughtered women found in sacks drifting in the Thames, a clear allusion to the Thames Torso murders of 1887 to 1889. These references are absent from the 1897 English novel, yet they appear in Stoker's early notes for Dracula. Stoker lived in London during the Ripper's reign of terror, and his journals show a mind preoccupied with the intersection of the supernatural and the urban pathological. By linking the fictional Count to the very real and unsolved Whitechapel murders, the preface suggests a version of Dracula that is less a mythic demon and more a contemporary serial killer. This first draft argument is bolstered by the presence of specific details in the Icelandic novel that appear nowhere else but in Stoker's private, unpublished notes. For instance, Stoker's journals mention a mute-deaf female housekeeper-slave in the Count's London residence. Makt Myrkranna includes a deaf-dumb woman who is apparently his slave. Stoker's notes place the Count's London house in the East End. Makt Myrkranna places it in the East End. The statistical probability of an independent forger guessing multiple discarded details from an author's private journals is, as researchers have argued, 1 in a million. This suggests that even if the preface was not written by Stoker's hand, the core information, the seed of the story, must have come from his discarded drafts. However, a devastating piece of literary detective work has cast a long shadow over the preface's authenticity. Large portions of the text are plagiarized from the memoirs of a Swedish priest named Bernhard Wadström. Specifically, the lifted text comes from an essay on ghost apparitions in Wadström's memoirs, a contemporary publication in Sweden. The Stoker preface lifts specific phrasing and intellectual justifications from Wadström, particularly regarding the idea that continuing research in psychology and natural sciences may one day provide logical explanations for the incomprehensible events described. It is highly improbable that Bram Stoker, an Irish author living in London, would have had access to, or the desire to plagiarize, the obscure memoirs of a Swedish clergyman. This suggests that the preface was constructed by the Swedish editor using the pseudonym A.E. to lend their unauthorized serialization, Myrkranna's Makter, the veneer of authenticity. This forgery theory is further supported by a linguistic neologism found in the Icelandic translation. Icelandic researchers noted that the word used for secret police in the preface was a newly invented term, created specifically for this text because the concept did not exist in Iceland at the turn of the century. Sweden, however, was a modern European state with a complex bureaucratic and police apparatus. The inclusion of the secret police as a group unable to understand the Count's crimes suggests a continental source. If the preface were a direct translation from a Stoker-provided English original, one would expect it to reflect British institutional terminology. Instead, it reflects the social and political landscape of Sweden. The preface, then, is a translational forgery, a text that claims to be a translation of a legitimate source, but is actually a locally produced fiction designed to masquerade as the original. The preface ends with a famous quote from Hamlet. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Including this quote highlights the Stoker-esque or Victorian flavor the forger was trying to emulate. It positions the story within a respectable literary tradition while simultaneously signaling the weirdness that is to follow. This quote, combined with the mention of Jonathan Harker and Dr. Seward, creates a bridge between the reader's reality and the powers of darkness in the text. Whether Stoker actually wrote the words or simply gave a vague blessing to the project is almost secondary to the effect the preface had. It validated the radical changes in the novel as being the true version of the story. We are left with a central paradox. The preface contains 1 in a million details from Stoker's private notes, yet it also contains blatant plagiarism from a Swedish priest and linguistic markers of a Swedish origin. This suggests that the preface is a hybrid text. Perhaps Stoker provided a rough outline or an early unfinished manuscript to the Swedish publishers, and the editor, A, then filled in the blanks, adding the criminal references and the Wadström justifications to suit the tastes of the Nordic readership. This would make the preface a collaborative, transnational, and deeply deceptive text, a masquerade within a masquerade. The debate over the preface's authenticity ultimately forces us to question the nature of authorship in an era of loose copyright laws. If the introduction to the book is a translational forgery, then the entire narrative that follows must be viewed through a lens of suspicion. It is a book that exists in the liminal space between authorship and adaptation, much like the Count himself exists between life and death. If the real Dracula was always intended to be a political conspirator and a ritualistic killer, as the preface suggests, then the forger may have been the only one brave enough to reveal Stoker's original darker vision. But if the preface is a lie, where did the forged ideas come from? And how did they manage to capture the exact intellectual preoccupations of Bram Stoker? Chapter 5. The Again Walker in the Howe. To understand the cultural resonance of Makt Myrkranna within Iceland, one must look beyond the Victorian drawing rooms of London and into the cold, heavy earth of the north. While Bram Stoker's original Dracula is an amalgam of Eastern European superstition and Western occultism, Valdemar Asmundsen's rewrite performs a fascinating act of literary repatriation. Through a mythological and folkloric framework, we can see that Asmundsen did not merely translate a British novel. He reanimated it using the bones of the Icelandic Draugur. This corporeal, malevolent revenant, a staple of the medieval sagas, provides the hidden subtext for the Nordic weirdness that distinguishes Makt Myrkranna from every other version of the Dracula myth. By stripping away the ethereal, shape-shifting qualities of Stoker's Count and replacing them with the crushing physical presence of the Again Walker, Asmundsen created a work that felt deeply indigenous to an Icelandic audience, eventually serving as a foundational text for the nation's modern literary landscape. The most striking evidence of this folkloric intersection is found in a profound scholarly irony regarding what Asmundsen chose to remove from Stoker's original text. Stoker, an Irishman who had studied Icelandic lore through the works of Sabine Baring-Gould, specifically the Book of Werewolves, gave his count the ability to shapeshift into wolves and bats, powers Stoker explicitly associated with his understanding of Norse mythology. Yet, Asmundsen, an expert in the sagas and an Icelander himself, systematically purged these elements. In the Icelandic version, the count does not dissolve into mist or take the form of a bat. This was not a failure of imagination, but a commitment to a different kind of horror. To Asmundsen, these Norse elements added by Stoker felt foreign and unconvincing. In the Icelandic tradition, the Draugur is a physical revenant, an opterganger, or again walker, that possesses superhuman strength and an immense bloated weight. By keeping Dracula in his human form and emphasizing his physical interactions, his scratching, his licking, and his bone-crushing violence, Asmundsen aligns the count with figures like Glom from Grettir's saga. Glom is not a spectral ghost. He is a monstrous, tangible presence that haunts a farmstead with a terrifying physical reality. This shift to the corporeal is further evidenced by the descriptive language used for the dead. In Stoker's novel, the vampire's primary physical characteristic is a deathly pallor. In Makt Myrkranna, the focus shifts to the blue and evil-looking appearance of the undead, a direct linguistic echo of the descriptions found in Eyrbyggja saga. When describing the Draugur Thorolf Lamefoot, the saga notes he was blue as hell and big as an ox. This specific ox-like bloating is a recurring motif in the sagas that perfectly mirrors the descriptions of the Count in the expanded castle section. When Thomas Harker discovers the room full of rotting corpses, the narrative dwells on the visceral stench and the physical corruption of the bodies. This aligns perfectly with the Draugur's association with the reek of decay and the foul odors that waft from burial mounds in medieval lore. By removing the foreign shape-shifting and emphasizing this indigenous physical weight and necrotic appearance, Asmundsen was reclaiming the vampire as a Norse monster, effectively signaling that Iceland did not need Stoker's Victorian inventions because it already possessed a far more terrifying version of the undead. The structural emphasis on the expanded castle section also mirrors the territorial nature of the Draugur. In Icelandic folklore, the undead are often categorized as vardmen, or watchmen, spirits who remain tied to a specific location, usually a burial mound or a home, to protect their treasures or exert their will. Stoker's Dracula is a cosmopolitan traveler, a creature of migration. The Dracula of Makt Myrkranna, however, is much more of a haugbúi, or mound dweller. The castle itself functions as a Howe, a burial mound. Thomas Harker's experience is that of a man trapped in a Howe, wrestling with a guardian who refuses to let him leave. The pacing of this haunting mirrors the sagas. In stories like Saga, the restless dead do not simply appear and disappear, they settle in, gradually eroding the sanity and safety of the living through a sustained physical presence. This connection to the sagas is deeply embedded in the prose itself. Asmundsen's writing frequently utilizes figures of speech and archaic expressions derived from medieval literature. While Stoker's epistolary style is a product of multi-perspectival Victorian thought, Asmundsen's narration feels like a return to the singular, authoritative voice of the saga-teller. The prose is concise and punchy compared to Stoker's meandering Victorian descriptions. For example, where Stoker might spend paragraphs detailing the psychological nuances of Harker's dread, Asmundsen focuses on the physical reality of the encounter, using the laconic delivery of the family histories. This stylistic choice extends to the removal of Stoker's favorable mentions of Viking berserkers. Asmundsen likely viewed these as decorative asides that made the Count feel like he was cosplaying as a Norseman. By stripping these away, he ensured the Count didn't just talk about Vikings, he embodied the actual threat of a Viking-era revenant. A significant point of narrative friction exists in Asmundsen's treatment of the door-doom, Diradomur. In Saga, this was a specific legalistic method used to exorcise ghosts, a formal trial held at the door of the house to sentence the dead to leave. Given Asmundsen's expertise in the sagas, his omission of this uniquely Icelandic legalism in favor of a physical execution in the London section is telling. It suggests a conscious preference for saga-style action over legalistic tradition. In the sagas, while a door-doom might be attempted, the most effective resolution is almost always physical. The Draugr is wrestled to the ground, decapitated, and burned. The final confrontation in London, where the Count is directly dispatched by a posse, reflects this decisive physical resolution. It favors the visceral over the meandering moral and legal debates of the English original. The reception of Makt Myrkranna in Iceland further complicates its folkloric identity. Despite a scathing contemporary review in 1906 that dismissed it as sensationalism, the book became a household name. This reaction was largely a response to what was perceived as foreign sensationalism, yet the book succeeded because Asmundsen had already Icelandicized the work so thoroughly. By the 1930s, Makt Myrkranna had become the generic term for the entire vampire genre in Iceland. It didn't feel like a foreign import, it felt like a modern update of an ancient fear, tapping into the existing psychic landscape of the Draugr. The most significant evidence of this enduring influence is found in the work of Halldór Laxness. A comparative reading of Laxness's 1968 novel, Under the Glacier, Kristni Hald under Jökli, reveals a profound debt to the Icelandic Dracula. While Laxness's novel is an investigation of a remote parish, it is haunted by themes of the undead that mirror Makt Myrkranna. The character of Ua, who appears to be a being who transcends death, and the atmosphere of the glacier as a kind of massive frozen burial mound, echo the Nordic weirdness of Asmundsen's castle. Laxness was not drawing from Stoker's English original. He was drawing from the visceral and folkloric hybrid that Asmundsen had created. In Laxness's hands, the powers of darkness are transformed into a modern existential inquiry, but the DNA of the Draugr remains visible. This literary lineage raises a question regarding the nature of translation in the Icelandic context. Rather than seeing Makt Myrkranna as a failed translation, we can see it as a successful adaptation that allowed the vampire myth to survive in a culture that already had a robust tradition of the undead. By injecting the story with Nietzschean undertones and the visceral horror of the Draugr, Asmundsen created a work that could speak to the Icelandic experience of isolation and the weight of the past. The ritualistic elements in the castle further align with this territorial, Draugr-centric perspective. The threat is not just a solitary monster, but a leader of a dark, regressive society that has taken root in the soil. The intersection of Makt Myrkranna and Draugr folklore also highlights the role of the landscape. In Stoker's Dracula, the Transylvanian mountains are a theatrical backdrop. In Makt Myrkranna, the environment is elemental and oppressive. The focus on the castle's architecture reflects the Icelandic obsession with the home as a site of both sanctuary and haunting. The Draugr is a threat to the household, and the struggle between Thomas Harker and the Count is a struggle over the control of domestic space. This theme of the haunted house is central to Icelandic literature, providing a bridge between the ancient mounds of the Vikings and the modern city. As researchers continue to compare the Icelandic text with the Swedish Mörkridsmakter, the question of authorship becomes increasingly complex. Yet the fundamental truth of the Icelandic version remains its synthesis of the modern and the ancient. By turning the Count into a Draugr, Asmundsen didn't just make him Icelandic. He made him immortal in a way Stoker's original could never quite achieve. He gave the vampire a body that could wrestle, and a history that was as old as the sagas themselves. This realization forces us to look at the landscape of modern horror and wonder how many other radical reimaginings are waiting in the peripheral languages of the world, harboring their own versions of the myths we thought we knew. If the real Dracula was always intended to be a physical, political, and ritualistic killer, then the Icelandic version may be the only one that truly captures the weight of that darkness. What other again-walkers are currently hiding in the archives of the North, waiting for the right moment to step out of their house and into the light of a new century?
The sharpest pivot in our analysis is the realization that Makt Myrkranna is not a peripheral translation, but a radical act of literary repatriation. By stripping away Stoker's shape-shifting Victorianisms and reanimating the Count with the bone-crushing, physical weight of the Icelandic Draugr, the text transforms a supernatural ghost into a visceral political predator. If the Icelandic version truly preserves the seed of Stoker's discarded darker vision, then which text is the true masquerade? The sanitized Victorian masterpiece we know, or the ritualistic nightmare that lay hidden in the North for a century? We leave that for you to weigh. Thank you for joining this analytical community. We invite you to share your own interpretation of this Nordic remix in the comments.